Hello. I'm going to read Combating Nihilism, Chapter 2, Section 3. Morality must adhere to itself. Things cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. In another possible universe maybe, or some alternate dimension where Earth does not reside, perhaps some alien can come up with some extra-dimensional math to say that in some other realm, things can both exist and not exist. But in our universe, they do not both exist and not exist simultaneously. Nothing in our reality can simultaneously hold its own properties and not hold its own properties at the same time. Here are some examples of things that are the exact opposite of themselves and therefore cannot exist. A tree that has none of the properties of a tree, a square that is not a square, or a group of 4 objects that doesn't have 4 objects in the group. What do any of those examples even mean? They're nonsense. It's like attempting to perfectly combine positive and negative. Positive numbers and negative numbers are both defined. If you have $100, then that amount of money is defined as a positive sum you own. If you owe me $100, then that money is defined as a negative sum you owe me. If you have both given $100 and I have received $100, then is there a debt? No. The debt isn't defined anymore. Its definition was canceled by its opposite. There may have been a debt previously when the 2 amounts were separate, but once the 2 amounts combined, the debt became non-existent. This is basic algebra. When a number is met by its exact opposite, the 2 functions cancel each other out. This is a very well-known and well-studied concept that something which interacts with its exact opposite no longer exists. Many brands of noise-canceling headphones try to take advantage of this concept. They attempt to minimize noise by recording the sounds around the wearer and playing back the opposite waveform into the wearer's ears. This is not yet a perfect cancellation because it takes longer than the speed of sound for the headphones to process the audio, which means the technology lags a bit behind in wave formation. However, this concept is not debated. Things met with their exact opposite cancel each other out, and they cease to exist. Morality is no different. For morality to exist as a rule in our universe, it cannot simultaneously hold and not hold its own properties. Imagine if the law of gravity also was the exact opposite of the law of gravity. It's ludicrous. If this was the case, then morality would be nothing but a bunch of made-up rules from people that want to control each other. Morality could not be a law like gravity, which exists regardless of our knowledge of it. It could only hold all of its own properties in the form of a thought in someone else's head, but not in the form of a universally applicable law, which means none of us would be obligated to do good actions and avoid evil ones, which means morality wouldn't exist. When I say that morality wouldn't exist if it were the exact opposite of itself, there are 2 ideas to which I'm referring. The first idea is that separation between good and evil is the opposite of no separation between good and evil. The second idea is that the opposite of desiring to do good is desiring to do evil. Specifically regarding the theory of morality, I've written in this book, the opposite of pursuing preservation and continuation is pursuing destruction and stagnation. It seems obvious that combining either of these ideas with its exact opposite would bring about the non-existence of morality. If morality was both the pursuit of good and the pursuit of evil at the same time, then it wouldn't matter what we pursued. A difference between good and evil might exist, but it wouldn't matter to us. If it means absolutely nothing to anyone on Earth, why would we talk about it? If it didn't affect anyone at all, why would we attempt to live it? We study scientific ideas because they affect our lives in some way. We might study a cool species of frog because we enjoy watching them. We might study how diseases form so that we can learn how to be healthier. We might study the law of gravity because it affects the way we build rockets. Each of these examples affected someone somehow, and that's why someone chose to study it. Since the law of morality only affects human behavior, if human behavior was completely unaffected, why would we study it? If it was just as natural to choose good or evil actions, morality could only exist as a lie used to control people. It could not exist as a real law of the universe. Also, since morality serves to differentiate between good actions and evil actions, if there was no differentiation between those two, morality couldn't exist at all. This idea is even deeper than there being no use in studying or attempting to live by morality. There wouldn't even be a difference that we could study. It could, again, only be a lie made up to control people. a lie that would fall apart if you thought about it hard enough, the same way a square that isn't a square will fall apart if you think about it hard enough. If we're not convinced, maybe we can salvage the idea that morality is both a separation and a combination of good and evil by saying that morality isn't a perfect system. It could uphold itself for the most part and fail at some pieces of itself, like the justice system. For the most part, it meters out justice, and every now and then it meters out injustice. Morality itself could still exist if it were simply imperfect, right? If morality itself attempts to preserve and continue the system for the most part, but it fails sometimes, what serves to divide which actions are actually good from which are evil? Perhaps there's a second moral law behind the first law from which the first law derives its idea of justice. If that one isn't perfectly moral, then it too must adhere to some other law behind that law, and we're left with an infinite set of laws, none of which explain the source of goodness, because all of them can't uphold themselves. This is commonly referred to in philosophy as infinite regress. Infinite regresses can be difficult to disprove. An infinite regress is fine as a philosophical answer so long as it doesn't lead to a contradiction. In this case, however, it does lead to a contradiction. If the infinite regress destroys the very idea of the thing itself, then it cannot be used logically because it would mean that everything involved in the infinite regress doesn't exist. There must be something non-contradictory at the end that is the source of all future concepts. Otherwise, the future concepts would be just as non-existent as the source concept. Morality serves as the standard of separation between which actions are good and which are not. For there to be a separation between good and evil, something must separate the good and the evil. There must be a dividing line. If none of the laws in this infinite set of laws is the real law, then where did the dividing line come from? What separates good action from evil action? After all, if the laws in the infinite regress are flawed, then they must occasionally contradict each other. Maybe one act would be considered evil by a flawed moral law, and then a later moral law would consider the same act good. Imagine we have a basin with a divider in the middle. We fill one side of the basin with milk and the other side with water. We're both allergic to milk. Even one drop would kill us. If we removed the dividing line in the basin and let it sit for a while, would you drink the water? Of course not. Once the dividing line is gone, there would be no way to determine if you were drinking water or milk. The two substances would be mixed. We would treat both the water and the milk as the same substance, and we wouldn't drink it. If instead we left the dividing line in the basin, including a watertight seal, we could drink from the water side freely, knowing that the milk was separate from the water. If there is not a clear division between things, we must treat them as the same thing. We must treat them as combined, unseparated. I know there are going to be people still hung up on moral grays. Surely everything can't be so black and white, they'll say. Okay, then in order to know which actions to pursue and not pursue, you'd have to have some way of dividing out the truly good actions from the truly evil actions, and then some way to divide out the middle actions that don't matter one way or the other. You'd essentially have to have water, mixed water plus milk, and milk. As soon as the water and milk mix, they must be treated as unseparated. Nothing in that realm could be treated as good or evil because you couldn't be sure which it is. Some moral systems do attempt this kind of marriage between good and evil. To do so, they seek to define types of actions that don't have any moral value attached whatsoever. However, if you'll remember back to Chapter 1, to have conscious thought and choice, there must be reasons for the things that we're doing. Even simple reasons like, I liked it, or it was fun, are still motivations. In order to have motivations, you must act like there are things you should pursue over other things. To say, I did it because I liked it, you would have to value things you like over things you don't like. If you're using any sort of system of preference whatsoever, you're using a system of morality. You're dividing the good from the bad. All conscious actions have this idea attached. If this division of ideas was not attached, you could not act. You would either be deterministic, having no option for choice, or you would be completely unable to act. Your thought processes would halt. This means all deliberate conscious action can't be morally gray. They all must have some non-zero value, being tied back to destruction or creation. I do think there is a category of action which doesn't have any moral value. Unconscious actions like breathing don't have any moral value, except when we begin to consciously regulate them. This isn't because unconscious actions are without reason. Even unconscious actions must have a goal in order to function. Unconscious actions like pumping blood through your circulatory system, releasing hormones into your body, creating new cells, etc. All are motivated by the goal of keeping us alive. These actions can't have moral value for us, though, because we don't have conscious control over these processes. Should someone with Tourette's syndrome be penalized for the way their body moves and reacts of its own accord? I wouldn't think it would be moral for the moral law to hold them accountable for that. Should a person who sneezes be held morally responsible for their sneeze? Is the sneeze a morally good action or a morally bad one? In a way, the function of the body is deterministic. We don't have a choice to stop those actions. We can kill ourselves, but that's not the same as choosing not to allow blood to flow through our veins. Instead, the moral value is attributed to the choice between living or not living. If we somehow gained conscious control of our normally unconscious processes like breathing on purpose, then I believe that the conscious practice of these actions would begin to attribute moral value to them. However, moral value is only attributed for any portion of the action which takes place in the conscious mind. The idea of moral grays isn't completely without merit, though. There are two sources for the term moral gray that wouldn't contradict with the separation of good and evil. The first is that there may be a varying degree to which each good action is good and each evil action is evil. Although all deliberate conscious actions must have good or evil value, they can vary in the degree to which they possess this value. For instance, writing a nasty note to a stranger about their parking job doesn't seem as bad as murdering them for their parking job. Murdering them seems to hold more wrong than the note does, even though they both seem like unnecessary and intentionally destructive levels of force. This seems to point to the idea that different actions may hold different moral weight. If we were going to attach numbers, perhaps murder would be 100 bad points, and a nasty note would be 5 bad points. These are completely arbitrary numbers. I'm just trying to say that some evil acts may seem worse than other acts, and some good acts may seem better than others. I do not know the source of an action's moral weight. I do wonder if it has something to do with how far removed the actions are from the source motivation. For instance, if I decide to go on a walk, I may have gone on the walk because I want to exercise. I want to exercise in order to remain healthy. I want to remain healthy so that I can continue to survive. I want to survive so that I can contribute to the world. I want to contribute to the world in order to preserve and continue the good things about the world. The source motivation for going on the walk would be preservation and continuation. However, going on a walk is about 6 steps removed from the source motivation. It seems to me that the closer the action itself is to the source motivation, the more weight it carries. The other non-contradictory source I can see for moral grays might be varying levels of knowledge and our inability to know a person's true intent. We talked about this in Chapter 1, Section 2. That all actions are technically neutral. It's the knowledge and desire behind the actions that creates the intentions. If the knowledge is incorrect, or if the knowledge is incomplete, it might lead to an unhelpful action that is still a morally good action. This leaves a lot of room for interpretation regarding other people's intentions and whether their actions are good or not. Also, as society continues to grow and our body of knowledge continues to diversify, it makes understanding other people's intentions even harder. I believe this is the main source of true moral grays. It's not that morality itself changes. Since morality is the separation between good and evil, if morality itself had any sort of gray areas, it wouldn't separate good and evil anymore, and therefore it couldn't exist as the separation between good and evil. The only gray areas can't come from morality's application of the rules. It can only come from our incomplete understanding of the rules, incomplete knowledge of the evidence required to determine whether an act is good or evil, or possible variation in the weights of various acts. All of these sources of moral gray would still maintain perfect separation between good and evil while allowing for morally good differences in behavior. These sources allow for the uniqueness of the individual. Regardless of what form of morality you adhere to, if there is any separation at all between what is good to do and what is not good to do, then the rules which govern the separation between different types of actions must be consistent. There is no way around this wall. It is there and it is immovable. It is an answer that we cannot assail. If the moral law exists, then it must be the reason itself that preservation and continuation are preferred. Otherwise, we're left with an infinite regress which destroys the separation morality provides, causing no distinction between good and evil, which is the same as saying morality cannot exist. Morality doesn't need to be parsed further. If we attempted to parse the idea further, we might ask, why are preservation and continuation desirable and destruction and stagnation undesirable? The answer? Because moral law says so. If moral law upholds itself, we're able to stop there. We have found the source of goodness. We don't need to look further for a reason behind a reason, behind a reason, behind a reason, etc. If moral law upholds itself, then it can hold all of its own properties. We don't need to look for the source behind the source because it is the source. That's it. If the moral law didn't uphold itself, it would be like when you ask your mom to go to the park and she says no, and you ask why, and she says, because I said so. A million questions go off at that point because you know your mom is a contradictory person. There's a possible way you might get around her defense of no, and the wheels in your head start turning. This is not like that. This answer is like saying good is good because it's good, which is like saying chocolate is chocolate because it's chocolate. Yeah, that's true, but I was hoping for something deeper there. The answer doesn't provide much satisfaction. I do ask myself constantly, why are preservation and continuation desirable? What do you do though when there isn't any more divisibility? What do we do once we've split the atom into particles so small that we find out that in the end they're made of empty space? What do we do when we can't divide any further? I'm not sure there's anything that can be left except acceptance of the outcome. The only way for morality to exist is if it upholds itself. Any other option would cause its own non-existence. Since this book is an exploration of what morality would look like if it were to exist, we're going to continue with the idea that morality exists, and therefore it must uphold itself. And we'll do section 4 next time. See ya!